They called me the Huntress, and the name didn't come from catching killers in the moment. It came from what I did after everyone else walked away. I hunted what had already gone cold. I worked cases that had settled into silence, where time had dulled urgency and buried truth under assumptions that felt good enough to close a file. I hunted across New York City, every borough, every block where violence tried to disguise itself as something ordinary. The housing authority was only one of those hunting grounds. It was never the only one. By the time Arthur Dole reached me, he had been dead for over 11 years. His case had already lived its life. It had been opened, worked, exhausted, and then quietly put away. Detectives had come and gone. Witnesses had given statements that felt sufficient at the time. The conclusion had settled into place with the kind of confidence that comes from repetition rather than certainty. Arthur Dole had been pushed from the window of his 22nd floor apartment in a Brooklyn public housing tower in the summer of 1999. That explanation fit the environment. The late 1990s in New York City housing authority developments were defined by layered violence. Narcotics operations functioned out of apartments and stairwells. Disputes escalated quickly because reputations were currency. Assaults, robberies, and retaliatory acts were woven into daily life in certain buildings. Residents who had no part in that world learned to coexist with it by minimizing what they saw and controlling what they said. In that kind of environment, a man going out a window was not unimaginable. It was explainable. Arthur Dole himself contributed to that explanation. The original file described him consistently across multiple witnesses. He was rude, frequently confrontational, and known to engage in aggressive behavior toward women in the building. Several tenants described him as a womanizer, others as simply crude and intrusive. He had arguments. He embarrassed people. He made enemies easily and seemed to carry no awareness of how those interactions accumulated into resentment. From an investigative standpoint, that profile created a wide suspect pool. The initial detectives pursued that angle, focusing on individuals with known conflicts involving Arthur. Statements were collected, timelines established, and efforts were made to identify anyone seen entering or leaving the apartment around the estimated time of death. However, there were no surveillance cameras in the building lobby, no exterior coverage, and no reliable visual documentation of movement. The case depended entirely on human observation and physical evidence. And that is where the case began to fail. When I reopened the file, I approached it the way I always do, with the understanding that I was not investigating the crime as it happened, but as it was interpreted. Cold case work is reconstruction. It requires separating fact from assumption, observation from conclusion. The most dangerous element in any closed case is not the missing evidence. It is the accepted narrative. The narrative said Arthur Dole was pushed. The evidence said something else. The autopsy findings had been documented, but not fully integrated into the working theory. There were ligature-like markings around the neck, not broad trauma, but controlled compression consistent with a narrow object applying force. In addition, The presence of petechial hemorrhages, small vascular ruptures, typically associated with asphyxiation, indicated that pressure had been applied to the neck while the victim was still alive. This raised a critical question. Was the fall the cause of death, or was it a secondary event? A fall from 22 floors will produce catastrophic injuries, including cervical fractures. Arthur's neck was broken. That fact had reinforced the original conclusion. However, a broken neck does not exclude prior strangulation. The sequence of injuries matters. If strangulation occurred first, then the fall becomes not the murder itself, but a staging mechanism. That possibility changed the entire framework of the case. If Arthur Dole had been strangled inside his apartment prior to being thrown from the window, then the original investigation had been built on a false premise. The focus on external conflict, hallway disputes, building enemies, visible confrontations would have directed attention away from a more intimate and controlled interaction. That realization did not immediately give me a suspect, but it gave me direction. I began re-examining the original witness pool, starting with individuals who had documented conflict with the victim. One name surfaced repeatedly: Leon Baker, a resident with a known altercation involving Arthur shortly before the death. Baker had a documented history of volatility, including prior arrests related to narcotics and disorderly conduct. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Arthur had publicly humiliated him during a dispute over money, escalating the situation to the point where physical intervention was required to separate them. From a behavioral standpoint, Baker presented as a viable suspect. Public humiliation can trigger retaliatory violence, particularly in environments where perceived weakness carries social consequences. However, the more I analyzed the case, the more a disconnect began to form. The physical evidence suggested control. Strangulation is not an impulsive act. It requires proximity, sustained effort, and a willingness to remain engaged with the victim during resistance. It is fundamentally different from a reactive shove or a sudden act of rage, which meant one of two things was true. Either Arthur Dole's killer was far more controlled than his public enemies suggested, or the investigation had been looking in the wrong direction from the very beginning. And as I closed the file that night, one conclusion settled in with absolute clarity. Arthur Dole did not die because someone lost control. He died because someone maintained it.